So hello everyone, welcome. My name is Dr. Mindy Chadwell and I'm a faculty trainer for the Mid-America Mental Health Technology Transfer Center. I'm pleased to be your host for this conference session and excited to introduce this session entitled Trauma-Sensitive Mindfulness for Grief, From Theory to Practice in Schools. I want to thank our wonderful speakers for being here with us today, and a big thank you to all of you for joining us. We truly hope you find today's presentation engaging and helpful in your work. Next slide, please. Okay, to start off, I would like to cover a few housekeeping items. We have made every attempt to make today's presentation secure. If we need to end the presentation unexpectedly, we will follow up using your registration information. All attendees are muted for today's presentation and cannot share video. If you have a question for the presenters, please go ahead and use the Q&A pod to ask those questions. If you have a comment or link for all attendees, please go ahead and use the chat box feature. The session recording and slide deck will be posted on our website within about 2 weeks. If you attend at least half of the session, you will receive an email following the presentation on how to access a certificate of attendance. This event is captioned. To view captions, click the arrow beside the CC box at the bottom of your screen and choose Show Subtitles. To change the size of the subtitles, click the arrow next to the CC box and choose Subtitle Settings, where you'll find the option of making the subtitles smaller or larger. And if you don't already, please follow us on social media and stay in touch with us. Next slide. We just released a series of fact sheets focused on addressing various grief-related topics, including defining grief, responses to grief across the lifespan, preventive strategies and protective factors, cultural responsiveness, and evidence-based treatments. You can check those out on our Responding to COVID-19 Grief, Loss, and Bereavement webpage, as well as additional information for more MHTTC events and resources. Next slide, please. We want to recognize that participating in this and our other sessions may activate your own feelings of grief and loss. As mental health providers and school mental health professionals, we also need to care for ourselves. Please monitor yourself and practice good self-care, including taking breaks, stretching, drinking plenty of fluids, and practicing mindfulness or whatever helps you in staying centered and grounded. If needed, here are links to helplines and hotlines. These are also listed on the Learning Institute website. Next slide, please. Our SAMHSA-funded MHTTC network focuses on technology transfer, which means the adoption and implementation of evidence-based practices for mental health across the United States and territories. We develop and disseminate resources and provide free local and regional training and technical assistance for the mental health workforce. Next slide. And here is our lovely map displaying the centers that make up the MHTTC network. We have 10 regional centers, a National American Indian and Alaska Native Center, a National Hispanic and Latino Center, and a network coordinating office. Please visit our website and find your center so you may stay up to date on trainings and resources offered in your region. Next slide. And this presentation was prepared for the MHTTC network under a cooperative agreement from the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, also known as SAMHSA. The opinions expressed in the presentation are the views of our speakers and do not reflect the official position of the Department of Health and Human Services or SAMHSA. Next slide. Okay, let's go ahead and get started. We have amazing presenters starting off with us today. So go ahead and advance to the next slide, please. We have Carrie Doyle, who is a clinical associate professor at the University of Southern California, Suzanne Dworak Peck School of Social Work. Her practice experience includes mental health clinical social work in the K-12 school and private practice settings. She co-developed a school social work field training program with a trauma-focused lens that trains school social work students on topics such as trauma-informed schools, trauma-sensitive mindfulness, supporting the grieving student, and working with communities around trauma and grief. We also have Lisa Wilby-Veet, who is a clinical associate professor at the University of Southern California, Suzanne Dworak Peck School of Social Work. Wilby-Veet's more than 2 decades of experience covers a wide range of needs, including individual, family, and group therapy in school, hospital, and outpatient settings. Her passion for working with trauma-exposed youth led to clinical service roles as a medical social worker, outpatient therapist, school social worker, behavioral specialist, and school-based consultant. Wilby-Veet has also participated in trauma response work within her various positions. Lisa and Carrie, thank you very much for being with us today. I'll go ahead and pass it off to you. Next slide, please.
We can proceed one slide forward. Thank you. Good afternoon. I want to reiterate, need extra coffee today, that oftentimes when Carrie and I are speaking, we have the opportunity to see each of your faces to identify if someone might be having trouble digesting some of the information. So we do want to encourage you to, if you need to, take a break, step away, potentially leave the presentation. Also, many times, I know I often sign up for different presentations and conferences with peers. And so, be kind to one another and check on those that maybe that are attending for the last 2 days and listening. Oftentimes, you were the most empathic individuals and out there serving your communities, and this information is sometimes very difficult as you continue to process and often going through some of these issues yourself. Today, we're hoping that we will provide some time for you to be in tune with your body and identify when things are too much. We're going to talk a little bit about the language surrounding loss and grief, how COVID, the winter season, and holidays are impacting the upcoming season. Carrie is going to she's a beautiful speaker and wonderful, will lead us through some trauma-sensitive mindfulness, what it is and how it can help those who are grieving. And we're going to practice some mindfulness practice. So hopefully you can leave today with some renewal for yourself as well. Next slide, please. We love to use the chat pod. So I'm hoping that since you guys can't communicate via your voices, that you can communicate with your fingers, but really kind of thinking about the school landscape. And if those of you that joined us last time, we kind of looked at, okay, how were practitioners and teachers and social workers and school psychologists and school counselors, guidance counselors feeling, as well as what are some of the feelings of those that we serve. And so I wanted to kind of get a pulse for you, how you are seeing your school landscape, either from your own personal point of view or what you're hearing from students. If you don't mind chatting in some of that. We either don't have chatters. Okay, then they're coming in. It takes a minute. Adults are overwhelmed, students are discouraged, not liking virtual school, umbrella depression. That's a pretty powerful, no motivation. Kiddos have been grieving social interaction. Kids are feeling bored. I think I go through a lot of these feelings every day: anxiety, stress, sometimes panic. And also we're looking at how many children who are struggling with some of the virtual learning, whether you're in person or virtual, and the other things that are at play, previous adverse childhood events, systemic racism, poverty, abuse, food insecurities and loss. So I'm seeing a little bit from the feed that there might be some individuals that have students in class, some that are like my children might be attending school online. Next slide, please. So I always want to start off kind of talking about the language of loss and grief. And I'm not pointing it out because one is more important than the other. I often find that children are very literal in their language, and sometimes in our attempt to be careful, to be thoughtful, sometimes when we're talking with children, you know, the words that we use can be difficult and confusing. You know, when we think of loss, it's typically we're describing something that might return, that's not so permanent, such as the routines that we've had from the pandemic. You know, I have living and coming from the city of Parkland and working very closely as a consultant following the shooting there. I have my own loss around watching my children, their loss of innocence of childhood, the loss of feeling safe, sometimes in school. And that is something very powerful. And many people across the world are experiencing loss from their routine due to the pandemic and the loss of those connections. Grief often describes something more permanent, such as the death of a loved one. A lot of times sometimes we'll talk to students, and I'll remember when my grandfather passed away, my parents woke me up and they said, "We lost your grandfather last night." And I wasn't really sure what that meant as a young child. And sometimes, you know, we're trying to be very thoughtful and careful around these topics. And sometimes it's just naming it and letting children know that it is okay to have grief and to have loss, but not always just being very clear in the verbiage, because sometimes that gets lost, especially when they're young or when they're confused. Even trying to explain it sometimes to someone else when you're struggling dealing it with yourself. So I just always want to bring that up to help, you know, sometimes our language when we're talking to children around topics of grief and loss. Next slide, please. I think it's really important to kind of look at when trauma and grief intersect. The last time we met, we talked about how the coronavirus has kind of put together some preconditions of trauma. And obviously nothing would be, you know, when we're talking about trauma, using SAMHSA's definition of psychological trauma is the damage to the mind that occurs as a result of a distressing event. Trauma is often the result of an overwhelming amount of stress that exceeds one's ability to cope or integrate the emotions involved with that experience. You know, not everyone who has trauma is grieving, and not everyone who's grieving is feeling trauma. But I do think that for families, for teachers, there are some common behaviors and symptoms that we see in children: mood changes, anxiety, behavioral changes, challenges in academic performance, attention issues, and really trying to consider how are we going to process those difficult stories and grief. And while many children and adults for that matter adjust well after a death, sometimes though there are others that have ongoing difficulties that interfere with everyday life, with what they're doing in school, with how they are feeling day to day. And sometimes it's difficult for those individuals to even recall the memories of their loved one. So it's important to recognize that sometimes a child could have a traumatic reaction after a death, especially when it's sudden or unexpected, and not having that opportunity to process. And if those are severe enough, then sometimes we have the outcome of childhood traumatic grief. And so I think, you know, when we're talking about what we're going to be seeing and what you all are seeing and working with in the classroom every day, the number of children that are experiencing these challenges are increasing. The number of adults working with these children are increasing. And oftentimes as adults and caregivers of children, that we're not always putting our needs first. And so I think sometimes we have to recognize, sometimes we're overwhelmed with what is happening day to day, and how do we help support ourselves and our peers so that we can come to work every day and continue doing this work. Next slide, please. So when we look at, some of the impact of recent grief and loss on school performance, this is not an overwhelming list. So if there's more that you can add in the chat, please do. But really, prior to the pandemic, about 70% of teachers identified that they had at least one student who had a significant loss of a parent, guardian, sibling, close friend in the past year. We're going to talk about what that looks like now, given the pandemic and how some of those have changed in an upcoming slide. But a lot of what teachers report and parents and guardians are seeing is that, absenteeism increases, children have difficulty concentrating in class, being withdrawn, disengaged. And this is something that many people put in the chat earlier on in regards to how children are feeling about school in general right now, decrease in quality of work, and not reliability of turning in on assignments. We're seeing students maybe that are not connecting in virtual classrooms. I was talking to a colleague who works within the foster care system, and approximately 25% of our foster care in some states are not, children in foster care are not attending or not logging into online classes. And so what are some of the challenges that are happening across different populations in your community? Anger, anxiety, all of those pieces that we're seeing, and then the need to support that in a virtual sometimes environment, or a teacher that sometimes is teaching both individuals in the classroom and individuals at home. Next slide, please. And then, of course, what is the impact to the family? I spend a lot of time working with families in my community around grief, loss, and trauma, and really obtaining their feedback about their experiences over the last 2 3/4 years. I think what I've learned most is don't let the fear about saying something wrong stop us from reaching out. I think it's really difficult sometimes to talk about these topics. Everyone thinks as a social worker that I would automatically know what to say to people. That's not always the case. I still think about it. I still process and have trouble sometimes. I do know that everybody's grief process and is different and is a different length of time. There's no one way or one process that each person goes through. But I think as mental health practitioners and teachers and those that are observing and witnessing these areas and needs in the classroom is, how do we listen? How do we listen to children? How do we listen sometimes to their body language if they don't have a voice? How do we anticipate the needs of children and families? I've found that a lot of times we don't, families might not know what they need in that moment. How can we continue to follow up, give them options so that they're not having, oftentimes it's like, what can I do to help you? And oftentimes though, we're fine. I think sometimes it's, what do we need to do to provide that ongoing support to families, to continue to check in over time, because, especially in the days, weeks after a death or a loss, there might be a lot of support. And as that distance comes, there's often a waning of that, which is also very difficult. And so how do we continue to look out and provide support over time for families and children we know who are struggling with loss and grief in the classroom and in our schools? Next slide. We're coming into a season, still very warm here in Florida, so I can't really say much when I'm still wearing shorts and a t-shirt. But there are a lot of additional grief stressors that are happening. We have been in a pandemic for months and months. And if you even gave me an inkling that this is where we would be in March, I would have told you that that is completely not possible. What is the impact of COVID? And I think that there's a tremendous amount. One of the biggest factors is that, there was a research done at Penn State earlier this year, and which identified 2.2 children would be bereaved and 4.1 grandchildren would be bereaved for each person who has passed as a part of this pandemic. So based on those estimations, there are approximately 1 million grandchildren who are sitting in classes that have experienced a death in the past 6 to 9 months. And half that many children. Sometimes it might be the teacher, it could be those people supporting. And so really it's the sensitivity of how we address and are kind and thoughtful and taking care of ourselves and sometimes trusting ourselves. And then we have winter weather, for many parts of this country, which allows fewer opportunities for children to be together or individuals to be together, because some of those outside opportunities that people were allowed to social distance are minimized. There is more people being inside. There's less light. Just even being in the time change. I'm always much more tired in the evening after. It's really how that light impacts sometimes our energy. And then we have the upcoming holiday season, which, starting, I think, I don't know about all of you, but I go out maybe once a week to go to run my groceries, any needs that we have in our family. We're pretty socially isolated here in my household. And about November 1 is when the holiday music, the advertisements on TV. I've gotten every something in the mail from probably every store about the holidays, and it's always filled with people smiling and chatting and having, and thinking that everything about the holidays is happy. And unfortunately, that is not always the case for so many families and so many individuals. And this year will be even more so. So how can we as educators, really our goal is to decrease that isolation for students and sometimes even our peers, to feel like they're not alone, giving opportunities to talk, students who might be thinking about their loved one, who might be missing them. And now we even have that complication of how do you do that within a virtual environment if your children are going to school fully virtually. Some of those individual conversations are a little bit more difficult to have. And encouraging students to talk to one another, which is also very difficult given some of the dynamics of the classroom right now. A lot of social distancing has also increased student isolation. So it's really, how do we support our students in classes over the next few weeks and months? Asking open-ended questions, trying to listen a little bit more than talk, asking students individually how their holiday season is going. If you know that they've had a significant loss, asking if they've been having thoughts about their loved one lately. Understanding and accepting emotion. Children with sadness and pain and frustration often have lots of different behavioral, sometimes outbursts. And oftentimes we're always wanting to make someone feel better. I think that, it's one thing that I teach my students all the time as they're learning and practicing to become clinicians is, they always want to take a positive spin on things. And that's not always the case, because in telling someone to focus on the good times also is telling them that you're not comfortable listening to the painful moments or what they're really feeling. And they might stop sharing, and having that opportunity to talk. And sometimes children might be really hesitant to talk to someone at home, especially when their parents are really sad. And so you might be that person that they reach out to. And then all the, classroom activities to kind of offer alternatives that allow them to maybe be thoughtful about doing the art projects that would include someone that maybe is still not with, that they live with or is no longer living. Having those open conversations and being sensitive about people being sad about missing people during the holidays, and asking if they've ever had an experience like that, because sometimes people aren't sharing, families aren't sharing some of the losses that they're having. Next slide, sorry.
So I'm always curious when Lisa and I give presentations on mindfulness, what is people's experience with mindfulness? So I would love, if you don't mind, if you put in the chat screen, either you're very familiar, so very, or somewhat, or a little, or you're completely new. I would love for it to just see in the very, somewhat, pretty familiar, okay. Wow, this is great. Oh, it brings me such happiness to see that so many people are familiar with it. And then if you're new to it, hopefully this presentation will give you some information that will be helpful. Oh, good. Some even practice with your staff and students already. Great, great. Thank you all for, and a smiley face. Thank you all for letting me know. I'm always curious. So Lisa and I wanted to talk to you about how mindfulness can be a helpful adjunct support when you're working with youth around grief and loss, specifically in schools. And I myself have been a mindfulness practitioner since I think it was 2002, 2003. And my enthusiasm for it eventually led me to become a yoga instructor trained through the Yoga Alliance certified yoga instructor. And when I first started my own mindfulness practice, it wasn't as well known as it is today. I was introduced to some wonderful authors and books on the practice, including John Kabat-Zinn, Wayne Dyer, Pema Chodron, and that's just to mention a few. And since that time, I've seen mindfulness grow in popularity. I've been so excited to see how mainstream and popular mindfulness is. You can find it everywhere now. I was actually in the grocery store and I saw a package of, I think it was pistachio nuts, but it was a package of nuts called the Mindful Nut on the package. And I just had to smile thinking, wow, mindfulness has really gotten everywhere. It's in the grocery store now. And I am excited about the popularity of mindfulness, but and I'm excited that there's now research out there that has demonstrated that mindfulness can be helpful in a myriad of ways, which we'll talk about. Because when I first started practicing, there wasn't the wealth or the quality of research out there, but now we're having some good research evidence about it. And people are anecdotally reporting that it's really helpful as well. So very excited that it's popular now, but I do have some reservations about its popularity, which we'll discuss today. Next slide, please. So I know those of you who put in the chat screen that you're very familiar or you're somewhat familiar, you might know these definitions. So, but I'm going to review them for if we have any participants that are not as familiar with mindfulness. So what is it? Sometimes people make the assumption that mindfulness is only meditation, or that mindfulness is to try to stop thinking. And certainly meditation can be one vehicle for mindfulness, but certainly not the only one. We'll talk about multiple ways to practice mindfulness. And removing all thoughts is not the goal of mindfulness. And I think I read somewhere that I think it was 60,000 to 80,000 thoughts a day the average person has. So in my opinion, the goal of stopping all thoughts would be near impossible. But what we can do is we can practice creating space between those thoughts, creating the pause, decreasing some of the thoughts we're having. So for today, we chose the following two definitions for mindfulness. The first is from John Kabat-Zinn, which is a very popular definition, and I'm sure those of you who practice know this. The awareness that emerges through paying attention on purpose and non-judgmentally to the unfolding of the experience moment to moment. What I take from that definition, I really highlight when I'm working with students, is paying attention on purpose and non-judgmentally. And then the second definition, mindfulness is a form of present moment awareness that promotes the ability to attend to, accept, and work with the experience as it occurs. And in that definition, I like to focus on attend, accept, and work with the experience, especially when it comes to grief. And I want to be really thoughtful in this moment to clarify what accept means. I'm using the word accept as to acknowledge and to recognize. I'm not using the word accept to indicate endorsement or fixing or correcting. And I also want to recognize that today, Lisa and I are speaking to a very secular interpretation of mindfulness because we are focusing on schools. However, we would be remiss not to mention its Buddhist origins. And there's a wonderful article by Dr. Ron Siegel that discusses how mindfulness has been incorporated in practices of multiple religions. So when we're working with someone who's grieving, if they do have a religious practice, then mindfulness can certainly be introduced to them in this context. However, since Lisa and I are specifically talking about it in the context of schools, we were deliberate in our decision to focus on the more secular, science-based aspect of it. Slide. And Ryan, I agree. Curiosity. I love the word curiosity. When I'm working with students, I always say, can we be curious about that? I love that word, especially. I would love to see a definition with curiosity in it. So thank you for adding that. And if I miss anything in the chat screen, I'll go back. I'm sorry. Sometimes I can't multitask and see the screen at the same time. So what is mindfulness not? We want to be clear today that we're not suggesting that mindfulness is a panacea or a cure. It will not make everything in our client's life better. It will not take away their pain. It will not fix their situation. However, for many, in the words of psychologist Dr. Tara Brach, it can be a refuge. Also, mindfulness is not a one-time standalone intervention. And since I saw so many very experienced practitioners put up on the chat screen, you know that this is a practice. And it can be a wonderfully supportive adjunct intervention. But the most benefit is usually seen when it becomes a practice. When individuals can practice regularly, they can often maximize the benefits. And we'll talk about what the research is saying about what are the benefits of mindfulness. Slide. So what does the present moment look like? I know when I'm trying to explain this to students, and especially when I was a high school social worker. So when I was trying to explain, what the present moment is, I like to use visuals. So mindfulness is the ability to be fully aware of this present moment, this moment now. For many of us, including myself, we can often become focused in our past thoughts. And what that might look like is regretting. It might be one of your students rehashing an argument they had with another student, replaying an event in their mind. And then conversely, if we're really focused on future-oriented thinking, that can often lead to the what ifs. And I always say what if can be a tricky question to ask, especially in this year, right? In 2020, where there's a lot of uncertainty this year in particular. I mean, there's a lot of uncertainty in general, but in this year in particular, not only ourselves, but our students have been faced with a lot of uncertainty. And so those what if questions can be really anxiety provoking. So Mindfulness is the ability to practice being right in that center, in that sweet spot, being fully aware of the now. Slide.
Sorry, I had to move my check pod off my mute button. So the impact of mindfulness. I think, when we're talking about mindfulness, there's a lot of research out there, especially in the last 5 to 10 years, that talks about some of the benefits of mindfulness, increase in self-awareness, the ability to reduce emotional reactivity associated with some of those negative thoughts. My favorite is increased compassion. That's just something that when I started to learn more through the sharing of information with my colleagues and really understanding that compassion and open-heartedness towards self and others. I'm always working on that myself. Decrease in symptoms of anxiety, depression, and trauma, and an increase in student academic performance, organization, and executive functioning. A lot of this was, identified as impact over the research of 5 to 10 years. I think that there was a mention of, what does it look like in regards to the numbers of students experiencing anxiety due to remote learning. And I think that there's going to be a lot of research to come on what that looks like as this continues for longer periods of time. Next slide, please. So specifically mindfulness for grief. And here's my favorite word again, compassion is the medicine we most need as individuals and as a species to healing suffering and freeing our spirits. And while we each have the capacity to love and compassion, it is an intentional practice that we develop a truly wise and caring heart. Grief is different for everyone, and not everybody is ready to make space or be present for what they're feeling in that moment. And so that's why we're talking today about being sensitive in regards to how we use mindfulness for those who have experienced grief and or trauma. Mindfulness isn't going to take away the grief. It's not going to take away the feeling and the emotion. It doesn't make it okay. The goal is it may help lessen the symptoms. It may provide a space for someone to be compassionate with themselves, and really looking at how grief and trauma are social experiences. And with COVID, some of those structures of support have been decreased. How can we, provide some supportive elements that can maybe transcend across computer screens and into classrooms that don't have that social component. So how mindfulness can help. I think it's important to know that mindfulness can cause more suffering when individuals are exposed to trauma and grief, and how do we empower and build resilience to make sure individuals are heading in the right direction of healing. Having a student sit in a room and close their eyes and think about something and have someone tell them to sit with it. We don't want to ask children to sit with their grief. We don't want to ask peers to sit with their grief. We need to be aware of that mindfulness can help reduce physical symptoms. It can assist with regulation of emotions. It can help someone stay in the present moment. They can increase compassion for self and others and calm the mind. Heather Stang has a wonderful podcast and so many really wonderful topics that I encourage people to take a look at. I think what is really important as practitioners or social workers or counselors or teachers working with children and their families is that we need to be aware of our own presence. Often others that are grieving may not know what they need, but they definitely know what they don't need, and they're sometimes very vocal about that. It's important that we're there to witness their grief and make them feel safe. And so I think it's really we're having others try to normalize that their body is trying to keep themselves from being overloaded, and what do they need to support themselves in that process. Carrie is going to talk a little bit in the upcoming slides about kind of our tolerance for that. Next slide, please.
Okay. So today's presentation is actually a continuation of our presentation from September. And in September, we discussed the trauma and grief semester-long training we provide to our students at USC. And for the purposes of today's presentation, we selected one of the topics from that overall training. And trauma-sensitive mindfulness is one of our topics. And typically we have about 3 to 4 hours to review it with the students. Today's presentation is an abbreviated version of some of the information we provide to them. So for example, we usually review the neurobiology of trauma quite extensively. And so there's a connection of why mindfulness can help calm the mind. But due to time limitations today, we won't be covering the neurobiology of it. However, I would really encourage you to go on YouTube, and there is a video by Dr. Dan Siegel called The Hand Model of the Brain. You can find various versions of it on YouTube. You can find versions of it more applicable to elementary school students, high school students. You can find versions of it that are great to have caregivers watch so they understand about the neurobiology of brain, the impact of trauma on it. Just out of curiosity, has anybody seen the hand model of the brain on YouTube or familiar with Dr. Dan Siegel's hand model? Yes? Oh, yay! Yeah, I love him too, Ronnie. Yes, yes, yes. Can't say enough about the hand model of the brain. This is a wonderful and easy way to explain the neurobiology of trauma to students, to teachers, to caregivers, to school administrators. So if you haven't seen it, the YouTube, I'm a big fan of YouTube. I like the visual part of it, although there's also flyers and handouts you can send on as well. And of course, Dr. Siegel has a whole book, but I find that the ability to provide psychoeducation can be a really empowering piece of any intervention, but it's specifically involving grief and trauma, because as Lisa said, especially with our students in school, oftentimes we're seeing that grief and trauma can intersect. So, but for today's purposes, we're going to briefly focus on the nervous system and how mindfulness can help reset our nervous system. I will also attempt to explain this in terms of psychoeducation purposes for students and families. So I'm not gonna go way into the scientific explanation of it, although I'd love to. I'm gonna really select the explanation so you can utilize it for psychoeducation purposes with the students you're working with and the families. However, if something that I say interests you, I would be happy to suggest additional resources, and I will do that at the end as well. So the autonomic nervous system. The autonomic nervous system is the largely unconscious control system, I would say, we have in our bodies that regulates breathing, our body temperature, digestion, bodily functions that we don't have to think about necessarily. So for instance, I don't have to, remind myself to digest food. It's just going to do it. So that's the autonomic, or the nervous system, or the control system of our body. And the autonomic nervous system is also involved in the fight, flight, freeze response. And the autonomic nervous system has 3 different components or parts to it. So it has the sympathetic nervous system, the parasympathetic nervous system, and the enteric nervous system. For today, we're just going to focus on the sympathetic and the parasympathetic, but the enteric nervous system is very interesting. So if you're not familiar with it, I would encourage you as well to take a look at it. So when we perceive fear or danger, our sympathetic nervous system can be activated. So what happens is our body starts to release stress hormone called cortisol, our adrenaline starts to be released, our heart rate increases. Our body is essentially responding to go into mobilization mode. And a long time ago, when we had to survive and there were wild animals around us, this was a great thing. It gave our body enough energy to run away, to fight. It shut down parts of our bodily functions so we could have the energy to escape and survive. And then the threat would be over. And then we'd be able to basically reset and transition from the sympathetic nervous system to the parasympathetic nervous system, the rest, digest part of our nervous system. And I want to be clear that the sympathetic nervous system is not bad. It's necessary. It's an important part of our survival. It's not a bad thing. When we face danger, even today, when we face danger, it mobilizes us to increase our chance of survival. However, for individuals who have experienced trauma, they don't have necessarily that feeling of safety. So often they can stay for long periods of time in that sympathetic nervous system, or it can be activated quite frequently and easily, and it can be more challenging to activate the parasympathetic nervous system or to reset. Now, looking at the year 2020, I suspect many of us, even those of us who do not have a trauma history, that our bodies are experiencing fight, flight, freeze quite a bit, that our sympathetic nervous system is quite activated right now this year in general. So what mindfulness practice can help with is it can help us initiate the relaxation response and transition into the parasympathetic nervous system, the rest and digest. Slide, please. Okay. So Lisa made mention of this, and I want to reiterate. So here we're talking about all these wonderful benefits about mindfulness, many of benefits you probably know. Mindfulness can potentially calm the mind and the body. Then why shouldn't everybody embrace every aspect of mindfulness? And as I mentioned, there are different vehicles or methods of mindfulness. Some of the approaches can actually exacerbate symptoms for individuals with trauma. For example, and a very simple, easy example of this act of closing your eyes may feel unsafe for some people. Or asking somebody to be introspective in a silent meditation and sit still, if that person has flashbacks, you're asking them to sit with that potentially. Or focusing on a body scan. So being reflective of physical sensations within the body when physical internal sensations might not be safe for that person, especially for individuals with physical abuse, sexual abuse, assault histories. And so some forms of mindfulness can actually have the potential to exacerbate symptoms and actually activate dysregulation. So here we have this dilemma. We have this wonderful practice of mindfulness that could potentially help somebody experiencing trauma and grief. But then we also have part of it that could exacerbate it. So that's what we want to talk about today, is specifically trauma-sensitive mindfulness. And how do we navigate the benefit and risk guide? Slide. So we come from a trauma-informed perspective. And this slide's probably not new to many of you. We're not suggesting that someone with a trauma history cannot practice mindfulness. However, best practice would encourage the use of the use of a trauma-sensitive approach. So framing your mindfulness practice around Samsa's 4 R's, realizing the impact of trauma on the brain, on the nervous system, Recognizing the signs and symptoms of trauma. So when someone may be experiencing hyper or hypo arousal during practice, and we'll discuss what that could look like in a few minutes. Responding by integrating the theoretical knowledge and the best practices we have from the research and from the practice, so that we can resist re-traumatization. And Lisa mentioned one of my biggest pet peeves as a practitioner and a yoga instructor and a social worker is when practitioners who are unfamiliar with trauma-sensitive mindfulness might be observing somebody struggling with mindfulness and telling them, stay with it, just stay with it, experiencing it. In essence, for me, that's like telling them to sit with your trauma. And I know I'm biased, but I think as practitioners in the helping profession, and we have a whole list of helpers that psychologists, counselors, social workers, administrators that I saw pop up on the chat screen, I think we are uniquely qualified to teach trauma-sensitive mindfulness because we have that skills of recognizing when somebody might be experiencing hyper or hypo arousal. So, slide. Okay, there is a citation that's missing from this slide, and I caught it at the end. So when you all have the slide deck available, you're going to see a citation on the bottom, but I'm going to tell you what it is because these individuals' works were really important in trauma and grief-sensitive mindfulness approach. So I want to recognize them. So of course we got Dr. Siegel. It should say Dr. Dan Siegel, 1999. It should say Rothschild, 2000, and it should say Trelevin, 2018. So when you actually get the slide deck, it'll say that on that. So I apologize for the oversight. It didn't transition in the formatting. Okay. Because trauma and grief can intersect in so many ways, again, it's always the best practice, in my opinion, to come from a trauma-sensitive approach because we don't know oftentimes our students' lived experience. Sometimes we do, but sometimes we don't. So when I'm working with a student around grief, I'm going to come from a trauma-sensitive approach. So we talked a little bit about theory, and our title is From Theory to Practice. So I want to transition from a clinical practice perspective. What does this look like? The first, and I feel the most important aspect, is teaching students about their window of tolerance. Their window of tolerance. This phrase was actually coined by Dr. Dan Siegel, but however, Dr. David Trelevin discusses it in his book as well. And I love his book. So if you're interested in this topic at all, his book is called Trauma Sensitive Mindfulness, Dr. David Trelevin. But the original term was coined by Dr. Dan Siegel. And the window of tolerance is essentially finding that comfort spot in which a student can practice a mindfulness activity and not become dysregulated. And Dr. Trelevin explains it beautifully, and I'm not promoting his book. It's just that good of a book. I don't get anything back from it, but it is a great book. And he explains it as the window of tolerance is when someone can engage with and be receptive to a number of different types of mindfulness activities. And those mindfulness activities can require cognitive functioning. So in the hand model of the brain that I referred to, and I'm very excited that some of you are familiar with it because you're going to understand exactly what I'm saying right now. But when you go back and you watch the video, it'll make the connection. So Dr. Dan Siegel talks about when we flip our lid, when we have a trauma history and we go into fight, flight, freeze, we can flip our lid. And what that means is the prefrontal cortex has gone offline, essentially, meaning prefrontal cortex is not communicating with the other parts of the brain. And so when we flip our lid, we can often lose the ability to engage in higher level cognitive abilities that the prefrontal cortex allows us to do because we're essentially in fight, flight, and freeze mode. So The window of tolerance is usually that area in which a student can experience a full range of mindfulness activities, even mindfulness activities that require the use of the prefrontal cortex, and they can do it quite comfortably. So what does it look like when somebody's outside of their window of tolerance? If a student is experiencing hyper arousal, you might notice they might be sweating, they might be fidgety, they might actually have a startled response. They might experience extremes of emotions. Sometimes, in schools, we can call this acting out. And so you might see that during the mindfulness activity, that they might become hyper aroused. The student themselves during this might report intrusive thoughts. They might report that they're actually experiencing flashbacks. So that's hyper arousal. A student who is experiencing hypoarousal might be they might seem almost like foggy or disconnected. They might seem like they're not listening to you. They might seem internally preoccupied, or if they're able to self-report, they might self-report a sense of depersonalization. So, and this is going to oversimplify this, but I find that when I oversimplify, sometimes it can help. When a student is hyper aroused, there's too much energy in the system. So they might be hypervigilant, hypersensitive to sights and sounds. And when they're in more of a hypo state, there can be almost like a disconnection or not enough energy. And I know that's very simplistic, but sometimes that can capture the presentation. There is a fascinating book by Dr. Stephen Porges, Porges. It's called the polyvagal theory, and I would highly recommend it if you're interested in this. Dr. Porges talks about how the how the vagus nerve really plays a significant role in our fight, flight, freeze, as well as the hyper and hypoarousal responses. So it's a phenomenal book. And again, I believe I have it in the resource slide, so if you're interested in it. So best practice suggested by Dr. David Treleaven and his research is that we shouldn't practice mindfulness with a student who's outside their window of tolerance. We shouldn't be practicing with them. We shouldn't be suggesting it to them if they're outside their window of tolerance. The key is being able to teach a student how to recognize themselves when they are outside of their window of tolerance, because when students are able to recognize it, they can modulate it. And when students are within their window of tolerance, they're going to find the mindfulness activity the most helpful. And so what does it look like if somebody's within the window? They'll look relaxed. They'll look engaged. They'll look alert, not disconnected. And essentially engaged with you and relaxed. And usually this is when they're in the parasympathetic nervous system. And this is an opportunity when they're within their window, like I said, to practice the higher level cognitive functioning and required mindfulness activities. So I've mentioned that a few times. What is that? An example of that could be a gratitude focused exercise, being able to say what we're grateful for. That could be require the prefrontal cortex. Another important trauma sensitive approach that I want to talk about, in addition to teaching a student how to understand their own window of tolerance, and hopefully being able to, modulate it, is to recognize when they're not in it and when they're in it. And it's working with the student to be able to find what type of mindfulness activity works best for them. As Lisa said, everybody's different. I know that sounds really obvious. Everybody's different in their grief journey and how they experience it, and everybody's different in what works with mindfulness. And I think as practitioners, it's really important that we don't take a one size fits all kind of cookie cutter approach to this. So teaching the student when to recognize their window of tolerance, when they're in, when they're without, but also teaching a student around what's known as a mindfulness gauge. And this term was originally, I believe, coined by Babette Rothschild, who's a clinical social worker, in her book, The Body Remembers Psychophysiology of Trauma and Trauma Treatment. And basically in her book, Rothschild discusses what's known as a mindfulness gauge. And a mindfulness gauge is just that. It's a gauge to determine how our bodies respond to practice, how it responds to stimuli. A mindfulness gauge is a tool to essentially evaluate a student's response to what's known as the different anchors of attention in the present moment. And the anchors of attention are basically the focus. And what a mindfulness gauge can do is it can help, again, a student stay within that window of tolerance. So let me give you an example of a mindful gauge. A great example of this is when we use our breath as an anchor of attention. Some people find focusing on their breath or breath counting to be very helpful. For others, focusing on breath can be incredibly distressing. Teaching students to recognize their own response and feelings to an anchor can assist them engaging if an activity is helpful. So for instance, if a student's focusing on breath and they say, you know, my chest is starting to get tight, my heart is starting to beat really quickly, that might be a sign that this is not the right mindfulness activity for the student in this present moment, and there might be a better activity. Now, that's not to say that a student can never do a breathing-based activity, but they might not be able to do it in this moment. Also, my rule of thumb is whenever I use breath-based work or even meditation-based work, I like to keep it relatively to the shorter duration. Also, giving options is really critical. So as I mentioned about the eyes closed, some people don't feel safe with their eyes closed. So giving them the option to keep their eyes downcast or soften the muscles around their eyes. I also like to invite students to add physicality to their practice. Some students sitting still is really challenging for them. It's not comfortable. And you'll see the pattern in all of what I'm saying is that we're giving students control and decision-making around their own practice. Finally, I always like to start with a sensory-based activity because I find it's always helpful for a student that has a trauma history, specifically accessing the 5 senses of the body rather than the internal sensations of the body. Because if you recall, I said sometimes a body scan or looking introspectively at our physical sensations internally can be exacerbating for some people. So I like to do a extra receptive sensory-based activity. So rather than focusing on the sensations within the body, they're actually focusing on what's happening outside of their body, the 5 senses. And this can be incredibly supportive for those students who tend to dissociate. And in our practice today, we're going to be demonstrating a sensory mindfulness activity. So, slide. Before we start to practice, I also wanted to go back to Babette Rothschild. She came up with the phrase, applying the brakes. I love that phrase, applying the brakes. This goes back to giving control to our students during practice. Giving them the opportunity to stop their practice, to take a break, to take a few deep, slow breaths if that's what works for them, to take a shorter period, to focus again on helpful external environmental objects. I love to always give students the idea that you can apply the brakes. So thank you, Babette Rothschild, for coming up with that. Slide. Okay. So creating a mindfulness toolbox. Let's get into practice here. The first slide is two mindfulness-based activities that are breath-based anchors, but they also have a sensory component. And again, I like to keep these on the shorter side because they're breath-based. The first is teddy bear breathing. This works really well with elementary school students. You can have them put the stuffed animal on the bottom of their belly. It encourages belly breathing. It's also great that you can teach to caregivers so they can actually practice this at home, and maybe their caregivers will practice it. The second one is sphere breathing using a Hoberman ball. I'm not sure if anybody's seen this. It's like $7.99. I got it at Barnes and Noble, $7.99. Why I like this paired with a breathing-based activity is it's tactile. They can touch it, they can see it. They sync up their breath. They inhale, the ball expands. Exhale. And again, it's encouraging diaphragm breathing, but it has that sensory base to it, which I really like. Slide. Okay. And actually, could we skip this slide and then come back to it? I hate to be a pain, but could we? Thank you. Mindful eating and mindful walking, especially for those students who like physicality. Mindful eating, mindful walking can be amazing activities that foster present moment awareness. So when we're walking, don't just, walk and kind of not pay attention. It's noticing the color of the leaves. I live in New England, so noticing the color of the leaves on the trees, noticing, oh, that street was just repaved. Oh, they just planted beautiful flowers. So it's that present moment awareness paired with the physicality, the walking. Mindful eating is paying attention on purpose to an activity that many of us rush through. And I will admit, I am guilty of eating my lunch at my desk, and I have no idea what I'm eating sometimes. And it's taking that moment to really look at your food, the color, the shape. If you can, pick it up in your hand. A good way to do this, the traditional way, is the raisin. And it's looking at the texture, the feeling of it in your hand, putting it on your tongue and noticing the texture and the taste. Again, it's that act of paying attention on purpose, and it also has that sensory component. As a side note, working in schools, we always want to be careful of food, well, just in general, we want to be careful of food allergies. Okay. Could you go back to the last slide? Let's see. Yes, thank you very much. All right. Before we practice, I want to be mindful to come at it from a trauma sensitive perspective, which is what we've talked about. And I'm not aware of all your lived experiences, and some of the content in these practices might cause you to be out of your window of tolerance. So some of you, please know, you may choose not to practice these activities with us today, and please know that is absolutely fine. You can listen along without practicing, or maybe right now it's just time for you not to practice, not to listen, and maybe come back and watch the recording. If you do decide to practice the activities, please know that you can stop at any time. Again, especially being in 2020, this has been a challenging year, not for just our students, but for many of us, not all of us. And you may be experiencing grief yourself or trauma. So please, if you're going to practice, please practice this with compassion for yourself. As I mentioned, I've been practicing since 2003, and a few years back, I had my own grief journey that I was experiencing. And I found that I was struggling with my usual ways that I practiced mindfulness. And even though I'm a clinical social worker, I'm a yoga teacher, I'm an experienced mindfulness practitioner, I know all the theories, I found myself forcing myself to practice the way I usually did, and I wasn't ready. And practicing actually caused me increased distress because I was trying to move through something and make meaning, and I wasn't ready to make space for it and be with it. And it wasn't until my own mindfulness teacher said, maybe you should try a different type of practice, Carrie. So again, mindfulness for grief is not a cookie cutter approach. And we all experience grief in different ways. So please know that you do not have to do this practice with us. And if you're particularly interested in getting more information about mindfulness, and specifically with grief, Lisa mentioned Heather Stang. She has a Mindfulness and Grief Institute, and she also has a book. It's really helpful. All right, so if you'd like to practice, we're going to do quickly a see, feel, hear activity, and then we're going to do a loving kindness meditation. So the see, feel, hear activity is basically that extra receptive activity. And I'm just going to do it very quickly and abbreviated. So if you'd like to practice, I invite you to sit back in your chair wherever you are. And please find a comfortable position that's right for you. Maybe that's with your feet on the floor. Maybe that's with your feet crossed. Maybe your hands are in your lap. Maybe you have one hand over your heart. Whatever feels comfortable for you in this moment. But just take a moment to get in that comfortable position. And if you'd like to close your eyes today, you can certainly do that. But if you prefer not to, you can just lower your gaze or just soften the muscles around those eyes. And just start to tune in to your breath. And if you can tune into your breath without judgment, we're going to start paying attention to what is around us. And so I invite you all now to pay attention to the sounds in your environment. Can you identify 2 things that you hear in your environment? So I can hear a dog barking in the distance, and I can hear the hum of my computer. Just really tune in. What can you hear? Now I invite you to see, come up with 2 things that you feel, not internally in your body, but around you. So I feel my hands touching each other, so I can feel my skin. And I actually feel my hair on the back of my neck. So 2 things that you can feel. And then if you have your eyes closed, you can feel free to open your eyes and look around your surroundings right now and choose 2 things that you see. I see my Hoberman sphere and I see my cell phone. And if it feels good to you right now, you can take a breath and exhale. And then start tuning in to your environment and see if you can hear one more thing that maybe you didn't hear before. You can kind of hear the hum of my lamp, the light bulb. And if you can't find anything else, just notice the same sound you did before. There's no right or wrong in this. And then transition to what you feel. So I can feel my legs against my chair right now. And then one thing that I can see. See my painting on the wall. So you might want to take a nice deep breath if that feels good to you. And exhale. And right now we're going to transition into a loving kindness meditation. And a loving kindness meditation, this is what's known as a metta meditation, and this is from the Buddhist tradition to cultivate compassion. I've also read some literature that it can assist with toning of the vagus nerve and can activate the relaxation response and actually impact levels of dopamine in our brain. So the meditation starts with compassion for ourselves and then moves outward to the greater world. So let's start with ourselves. And you can feel free to just listen to me, or you can feel free to repeat it with me if you'd like. May I be filled with love and kindness. May I be safe and at peace. May I be well in body and mind. And may I be at ease and happy. May I be filled with love and kindness. May I be safe and at peace. May I be well in body and mind. May I be at ease and happy. And if you'd like to continue focusing the compassion towards yourself, I so invite you to do that. Some days we need all the compassion we can get for ourselves. So if you'd like to continue with yourself, please feel free to do that. Or you can think of somebody in your life that you're really grateful for. See if you can put that person's image in your imagination. May you be filled with love and kindness. May you be safe and at peace. May you be well in body and mind. And may you be at ease and happy. You may want to select another person that you're grateful for, or maybe you want to select somebody who challenges you, somebody who it's not always so easy to be around or interact with. Your choice, you decide. Then once you have that person's image in your mind, may you be filled with love and kindness. May you be safe and at peace. May you be well in body and mind. And may you be at ease and happy. And then we move this out to the greater world. May we be filled with love and kindness. May we be safe and at peace. May we be well in body and mind. And may we be at ease and happy. And when you're ready, you can feel free to do what you need to do. Stretch, breathe, whatever it is in this moment to give compassion to yourself. And whenever you're ready, you can feel free to engage back in presentation. Feel free to change the slide to the resource page. Great, thank you. So this was just a brief overview of trauma-sensitive mindfulness, specifically on grief from theory to practice. As I said, Lisa and I, when we're doing this training with our students at USC, we spend 3 to 4 hours on it. If you're interested in more information about this, one from the neurobiological aspect, Dr. Dan Siegel, there's so many books out there. He's phenomenal. If you're interested in the impact of trauma-sensitive mindfulness on the nervous system, again, the polyvagal theory by Stephen Porges. He also works with a social worker named Deb Dana, who does clinical applications of the polyvagal theory. So if you're interested in more of the nervous system aspect and the vagus nerve aspect of it, you can do that. For specific trauma-sensitive mindfulness practice, again, Dr. David Trelevin, he has a great website. His book's wonderful, and I think he also has a free newsletter and a monthly meeting. And then again, from the grief perspective, the Mindfulness and Grief Institute, Heather Stang, is an incredibly helpful resource as well. So hopefully this was just enough information to encourage you to consider adding a trauma lens to your practice, whether you're an experienced practitioner or you're new to the practice. Lisa and I wanted to thank you all for joining us today. And we wanted to thank Mindy and her team so much for inviting us here to share with you. 2020 has been a year. So Lisa and I wish you all well. We wish you all safety. And certainly, Lisa and I love this topic, so you can certainly make outreach to us if you have any additional questions or if you want to engage in additional discussion. So thank you all.
Thank you very much, Lisa and Carrie. Can we go to the next slide, please? Such powerful experiential exercises. Thank you. We appreciate you sharing your expertise and your trauma-sensitive approach. And we have several questions in the Q&A pod. So I will turn it over to Dr. Sarah Wise to lead us through our Q&A portion today.
Thank you, Dr. Chadwell. We have some really great questions on here. So I'll start with the first one from Michelle. So are there any data on the number of students who are exhibiting anxiety now due to COVID and remote learning?
Lisa, did you want to take that one or do you want me to?
Go for, you can start, you can go first.
Okay. So, preliminary data right now is demonstrating that there's a tremendous amount of anxiety around COVID. And I wouldn't just say with students, I would say the full age range of our population is demonstrating more anxiety, specifically around COVID. Is remote learning exacerbating that? I think, as Lisa said, right now, from what we hear, is the research is just being done. that we don't completely have the answer to the remote learning question, but I do know there's a tremendous amount of research being done. I myself am in a doctoral program right now, and some of my cohort members are actually doing COVID specific research. So I think we don't specifically know the answer to the online learning question. Lisa, have you heard anything else that I'm not familiar with?
I think it varies from place to place. Having the opportunity to work in a virtual academic center with students that live in different parts of the country. There's another question about, how, I think the next one, how are schools and mental health services planning to address the surge of needs? And I really do think that's very individualized, just in the experience of talking to our students who are doing their clinical practice within schools across the country, and the gross difference in their experiences from state to state, from district to district. I work in South Florida, and so I know it's been an ongoing process of trying to support our students, because we were a large percentage of the population, including my own children, are going to school 100% remotely from home. And so I do think that there's going to be a lot of challenges when students are returning back to fully, in-person learning. So much more is going to be, teachers are going to have so much more to have to kind of engage in, as it's the routines, younger children who have been out of school for, could be almost a year, or have started school 100% virtually. So I do think that this is an ongoing dialogue that will need to continue. And I think together we need to continue to have these conversations on how individual places are doing it well, and what are some of the resources that are out there.
Absolutely. Thank you, Carrie and Lisa, for your answers. So it sounds like you touched on a little bit that second question about addressing the possible surge. There's a related question regarding the challenges with online counseling with students. So what are some strategies that you've seen or used or heard of to increase the effectiveness of our interventions when working in a virtual setting?
So Lisa and I have both been teaching virtually for 10 years, 10 years. So this is actually not a transition for us. And when I first started teaching online, I always thought, because I taught at a brick and mortar university before, and I'm thinking, there's no way I'm going to connect with my students in the same way. And I don't connect with them in exactly the same way as if they were right in front of me, but I've been able to really work on the rapport building. So I'm still having the depth of connection, and you just have to take it from a different approach. Now, specifically when it comes to counseling, this is a question that's coming up time and time again, especially with our social work students who are placed in schools and doing online counseling. Privacy is definitely an important part of it. Who's around them when they're talking? Can they have earbuds? So that privacy and confidentiality component is great. You yourself trying to be comfortable with the technology, right? So when your dog barks, not being upset that your dog barks, because your dog's going to bark, although mine's in the back room, so you can't hear her if she's barking, but your dog's going to bark, and not trying to come from a place of being, it's going to happen, it's okay, and normalizing that experience, and then focus on that and that rapport building. So ideally, I would like to be practicing mindfulness in person. I would. But ask yourself, and hopefully I was able to connect with some of you virtually, even though we were practicing thousands of miles apart, hopefully. And so it comes back to that rapport building, to that being authentic and genuine, and you yourself being fully present, and you yourself being compassionate with yourself, because we all have lives outside of our roles and our jobs. And we ourselves might be experiencing stress and anxiety and depression, especially this year. Lisa, did you want to add?
I think that there's an important component that we've had the luxury of having for 10 years is our students are on camera. And I see that differs across the country in different districts, even within my own household. I have two older children who are at a university level and never on camera. And I have a middle schooler that's always on camera. And so, if you're working through, let's say, a school district, are students on camera? Are you having that opportunity to see them personally? In regards to their frame, how much you see. I think that is an important dynamic and dialogue. Carrie and I both teach a course where students are working with an actor over 12 weeks in regards to evidence-based practice work in a telehealth type of setting. And part of it is being comfortable in the environment and watching that does take time. So as she said, this will be my 10th year teaching virtually for USC. And initially, it took a little bit of time. Actually, the first time I met Carrie, we had worked together 3 years. And I didn't actually remember that we had never met before, because it felt, we kind of transcended. But part of that was the comfort of having, that exposure over time. And so I definitely encourage, if cameras are allowed through your school district or in your practice or for your students, when it is safe, I encourage virtual backgrounds and privacy. I've struggled with it a little bit with group. I run a group, and it has felt different virtually. And so, how could we kind of bring that togetherness? It takes time, I think, to totally change to a different way of practice.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. I do want to be mindful of time. Dr. Chadwell, do we have time for additional questions? I think we have 2 more on here.
Yeah, let's go ahead. We can have time for one more question, I think.
Okay, perfect. All right, so our last question then, when utilizing mindfulness exercises in a group, how can we recognize that students are outside the window of tolerance? So how do we balance group members' differences in order to make it therapeutic for everyone?
Absolutely great question. So let me take that from 2 angles. One, the question is, how do we recognize when somebody's not in their window of tolerance? And 2, how can we make it equitable? So I'm going to divide that question into 2 if it's okay. One, how do we recognize if someone's not within their window? One, we can look at the physicality. So if they're in hyper arousal, they might be more fidgety than usually. They might be perspiring. If they're hypo-aroused, they might kind of be looking distracted and foggy. And after the mindfulness activity, they might appear like they're not listening or they're disconnected. So you have the signs from a clinical perspective as practitioners of hyper and hypo arousal. And then you can have a conversation with the student afterwards and say, what was that like for you? And they might report, rumination of thoughts. They might report flashbacks. And so their self-report, if you can meet with them afterwards, if you're noticing that they tend to be struggling with it, get a sense of what that was like for them and ask them the questions around it. The second question is, how can we participate in a group and make it equitable for everybody? I am biased in this perspective. I'm always, when I'm in a group setting, I'm going to look at it from a trauma sensitive perspective, because I don't know necessarily everybody's lived experiences. And sometimes students have a history of trauma that we don't know about. So I'm going to try for best practices. I'm going to encourage them. I'm going to talk to them about their window of tolerance so that they know what it is and what it feels like. I'm going to encourage them to do the mindfulness gauges that we talked about from Rothschild, which will help them go, oh yeah, my breath makes me feel tight right up here when I'm focused on my breath. So those mindfulness gauges. And I'm also going to give them lots of control. If they need to take breaks, if they need to step out, if they need to go out of the group, give them the control and the option and the decision-making in the group to say, no, this doesn't feel right for me, and to stop the exercise, to stop the activity. So hopefully that helps.
Thank you so much. Thank you to our speakers again. Next slide, please. And thank you for your thoughtful discussion of grief and trauma, sensitive mindfulness. Thank you all very much for attending.